So I want to talk about a film called From a Whisper to a Scream. It was made in 1987, directed by a guy called Jeff Barr, who went on to direct things like Stepfather 2 and Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. And but don't hold that against him. That was a bad joke. And it stars Vincent Price, one of my favourite horror actors of all time. Just one of my favourite actors of all time. And it's an anthology horror film. Like I say, it was made in 1987, but a lot of people haven't heard of this film. If you have heard of it, you might have heard of it under its alternative name, which was The Offspring, which was a name that they didn't want to give the film. And it does seem to refer mostly to the first story, because this is an anthology horror film, much like some of the other films I've talked about. Now, I watched this recently, and I think I watched it when I was younger, but uh, yeah, I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed watching it, and I was quite surprised by it recently when I was checking it out again. Now, the wraparound story for this anthology horror film is that the film starts off with a woman being executed, and she's given a lethal injection, and a reporter who's covering her execution decides to go and speak to her uncle. Now, her uncle, played by Vincent Price, raised her, and what the reporter wants to know is, why did this woman become a killer? So she goes to speak to Vincent Price, and after Vincent Price tries to get rid of her a little bit, what happens is he eventually starts to tell, look, it was nothing to do with her upbringing. It's to do with the town that they live in, a place called Oldfield, which I kept thinking of Haddonfield, but no, it's Oldfield, and he says that it's this town that made her a killer, and what he means by that is that the town has a long history of strange occurrences. The town seems to attract either evil people or it turns good people evil. So what happens is the film is really about how he sits, it's late at night, and he, sorry, got a frog in my throat, not literally. He sits in his library with all these sort of old dusty books, and what he's been doing, he's been cataloguing everything that's been happening in the town. He's like an historian, but he feels it's his duty to try and so hopefully someone can maybe find out about this town one day, or realise what's going on. So he picks 4 stories from the town's history to illustrate to her why the place is just bad, and then we see those stories play out. So that's the wraparound story for that holds the film together. The first story I thought was fantastic. It follows a man in probably his 60s, I would say, who has a fascination with a younger woman. Now, he lives with his middle-aged sister, who he seems to have some bizarre incestuous relationship with. At least it's implied, and at the same time he is having these dreams, and in these dreams he is encountering this woman that he's obsessed by, and she seems to keep turning up as this sort of rotting corpse. So anyway, what happens is that eventually he asks her out, and she's pretty mean, to be honest, as are most people in this film. And she just goes out with him one night just to get a free dinner, and when he tries to kiss her and she tells him he has no chance, he ends up killing her. And then some other things happen, but it's that's as far as I should probably go without spoiling it. The film is, the story rather, is really, really enjoyable, and it's twisted. It's really twisted. It's kind of, it's played in a sort of tongue-in-cheek way, but it's almost like you're watching someone about to become a serial killer. That's what it feels like when you're watching this, and you're actually seeing someone just who has had all of these twisted and perverted ideas their whole life, just one day snapping and deciding that's it, today's the day. And I found that interesting. The performances in it were excellent. I can't remember the name of the lead actor, but I have seen him in a lot of things. One of those, that guy. Um, and that guy was excellent. uh, and the only thing that lets it down is that, and this isn't ruining anything, but at the end of the story, something turns up, and it's a creature, and they use creature effects to show it to you, and it's basically looks basically like a sort of rubber, or is there any animatronics in it? I think there is. I can't remember. It the creature just, they build it up well, and then all of a sudden you see it for the first time, and it's kind of like quite hokey, and it's aged terribly. And to be fair, I think I would have laughed at it when I originally saw it when I was a kid. And um, there is a shot right at the end of the story where you do see the creature standing there, and it's really well lit, and does it does work. It's excellent. But for the most part, that was the only thing that let it down. But if you can get past that, then absolutely fine. I can get past that because sometimes I think there's a charm to special effects that don't quite cut it. But yeah, really interesting story, really twisted and perverted, and definitely my favourite of this film. And it's also, I think, one of my favourite stories from any anthology horror film. I thought it was excellent. So the second story is about a man who he's basically a scumbag who has had some dealings with some gangsters, and he's hiding out, and his girlfriend betrays him and tells the gangsters where this man's living, and he then tries to escape when they turn up, but they shoot him, and they think they've killed him out in the middle of nowhere, but they've not. He manages to crawl down a river embankment and crawls into this little sort of makeshift canoe that happens to be sitting in the water, and he just sort of drifts off into, it's like swamplands, in the south of America, not South America, but like I don't want to get my geography wrong, but in the south of the United States, uh, and what happens is that he passes out because he's got this gunshot wound, and he then has a horrifying dream, and then wakes up in this old shack, this old hut that's been cobbled together by someone, and he finds that there's a man sitting there, and he's been tending to this guy's wounds for weeks, and he's finally woken up, but he's still not got a lot of strength. But anyway, the man that's rescued him and saved his life helps sort of bring him back to health, but while his strength hasn't quite returned, he starts spying on the man because he starts realizing that there's a lot of strange things in the hut, things that are reminiscent, I think, of I can't remember. There was a form of religion that was a mix of different things in that area, and I know the name of it, and it's totally that was it leaving my brain, by the way. But anyway, it's kind of like a mix of voodoo and Christianity and things like that. And what happens is he follows the man, and he sees that he's involved in rituals and things like that. Anyway, he clocks on to the fact that this guy actually has powers brought about by the rituals, and he wants those powers, so he starts conniving and trying to persuade the guy to teach him how to gain these powers himself. And the main character's just an absolute scumbag, so you're never rooting for him. And the end of it's a horrifying concept. But yeah, I thought the second story was good. It was well done. I mean, it's mainly just two guys in a room for most of it, but That can be excellent. It was interesting. Enjoyed it. Not as good as the first story, but it was good. The next story is about a carnival that I think comes to Oldfield and the town, and it's about a man who is one of the, and I use this in inverted commas, freaks. He's a sort of member of the freak show, and he's fallen in love with a girl outside of the carnival, and he wants to leave with her. Now, what his talent is that he can eat glass. He can eat all sorts of sharp objects and things like that and swallow them. So you think, fair enough, the guy wants to run away, elope with this girl. But the problem is that the other people that work in the carnival are, they don't want him to leave. And the woman who actually runs the carnival, you find out, has like a sort of supernatural power where she has actually given the people in the carnival their powers. As long as they stay in the carnival, they'll be okay. But she's a really, really evil piece of work. So, you know, not to be too politically correct, but it was the only thing that sort of partially bothered me. Even though everybody's like an arse in this film, apart from Vincent Price. It was like you had two black characters and they just like associated both of them in different stories with black magic, you know, and stuff like that. But anyway, and probably it's just my imagination, but I'm not saying the film's racist or anything like that. It's not. It's just like, you know, kind of the two characters are very much sort of stereotypes, and I'm sure the people that set out to make the film didn't think weren't aiming for that, but you know it comes across a little bit that way. But I would just sort of laugh it off, to be honest, because the film's still enjoyable. Um, but I don't think there's any real harm done by it. I don't know why I've went a tangent into that. It's not a racist film, okay? So the story is then about how the guy and the girl elope together, and the woman who runs the carnival tries to seek her revenge for him breaking out from what is essentially a prison. This was my least favourite story out of all of them. Um, it was okay. It was alright. Um, if I remember rightly, though, it's just some of it I felt didn't really come off very well, and it didn't really feel like an awful lot happened in the story. Um, what it did remind me of was that old film Freaks, from the 30s. It reminded me a little bit of that film, and I think that's what the director was going for in a way. But yeah, it wasn't boring, but it just felt like there wasn't an awful lot to it. So anyway, the final story, the fourth story, is about it's set in the Civil War era, and it starts off following, I think it's a small group of men from the Northern Army, and it starts off with a couple of guys from the South try to surrender, and they just execute them. And the leader of this sort of group of soldiers is just, he's a nasty piece of work as well. Anyway, they come to this little town, Oldfield, and they end up being captured. They find out that in this little place, it just seems to be all children. There's no one else there but children that are living there. And one thing leads to another, and the men end up being captured and, you know, brutally tortured by a lot of the children. And the children keep referring to someone who is coming, and you get the feeling that it's maybe like the devil or something like that. Someone that is inspired them to, I think, wipe out all the adults. So it's got a little bit of like the Midwich Cuckoos, or a village, you might know that as Village of the Damned. It's got a little bit of that going on, a little bit of Children of the Corn in there as well. Um, and it's okay. It's an alright story. It's alright. I enjoyed it enough. I think the actor who played the main part did really really well. Uh, he's a really nasty piece of work. I mean, that's the thing about this film, is there's very few people in it that you actually root for. Um, so yeah, that's the four stories, and definitely the first story is really really strong in my opinion, really strong. The second story is decent. Third story I think is the weakest, and the fourth story is decent. And then the wraparound sort of it's completely predictable the way the wraparound ends. To be honest, there are only one of two options that you can really be thinking about how this is going to end, and but it, but you know, I really like this film. I think it's 1980s anthology horror films for the most part aren't that great, but I've watched a couple of older ones, a couple of ones from the 80s recently that I've really enjoyed, and this was one of them, From Whisper to Scream, or The Offspring. And another one I'll be reviewing shortly called Nightmares. And I think these films never quite reach the heights of something, you know, things like Creepshow, or certainly not the Amicus series from the 70s and 60s, but they're really solid anthology horror entries, and this one really surprised me. I thought it was brilliantly lit. This film, it had sort of grittiness to it, and it sort of took me by surprise. Um, I really enjoyed it, and I would really recommend it. Not a lot of people know about this film. Um, but I remember it kicking about when I was younger, called The Offspring. So I'm sure those people are going to say this is a famous film, but to me, I don't think it really seems to be. I was reading about it, and it's interesting that apparently, in correspondence with I think it's with a German actor or something like that, Vincent Price said that he hated the film, which I think's a shame. I think, yeah, I think it's Vincent Price's last full role, other than like Edward Scissorhands and things like that. But I think it was like the last full horror film he did, and yeah, it's maybe not the best film to go out on, you know, quite an illustrious career, but it was solid. I think he felt. He said on it that he loved the director's enthusiasm, and that's why he did the project. But it turned out he felt like his agent had misrepresented what the film was going to be that he'd signed on to do. But you know, Vincent Price is awesome. He's brilliant, and he gives a great performance as he does in everything. Um, so From a Whisper to Scream, 1987, Vincent Price, and what more could you ask for in an anthology horror film? It's well, you could ask for a bit more, to be honest. I don't know why I said that. Uh, yeah, definitely check it out. And it's one of the few anthology horror films in the 1980s that's of a quality, in my opinion, and it's definitely worth a watch. So check it out, and I'll speak to you all later. Bye for now.